Only a voice, Master Yelland, not a pianist. Dr. Aubrey Sennett said it kindly enough, the way a schoolmaster corrects a boy's Latin declension, and struck a line through the last name on the competition list before the whole rehearsal hall could look away in time. I was standing by the vestry door with a basket of anthem copies over my arm, waiting to catch my husband, the dean, before chapter meeting, and so I saw all of it. The 10-year-old boy in his patched gray jersey, going very still, the pen scratching, the other choristers suddenly fascinated by their own boots. Kingsmere Cathedral had never lacked for boys who could sing an octave beyond their years, and Thomas Yelland, scholarship chorister, son of a stonemason who had died the winter before last, sang like something poured rather than trained. But it was the last Friday before the St. Cecilia's Day competition, when every boy in the school played a piece before the bishop and half the county, and Dr. Sennett had just told him he would not be one of them. "You misunderstand me, Yelland," Sennett went on, not unkindly, folding his hands behind his back the way he did when he believed himself being fair. "A voice like yours is a gift I've not heard in 15 years at this school. I will not have it strained by hours hunched over a keyboard when you ought to be resting it. Besides," he glanced, not unkindly, toward the battered upright in the corner of the practice room, as if it were evidence. "The piano wants years most boys your age haven't had. Mr. Pruitt has been at it since he was 6, with a mother who played. You've had, what, borrowed hours before matins?" A ripple of laughter went round the older boys, not cruel, just the easy laughter of boys glad the correction had landed on someone else. Thomas did not laugh. He looked at his own hands, chapped from the cold dormitory, and said nothing at all, which I have come to believe was the most dignified thing a 10-year-old could have done in that room. I confess I nearly spoke. I had heard Thomas at that same upright more mornings than Dr. Sennett knew. Before 6, before the fires were lit, when I came down early to see to the flowers for the Lady Chapel, and found him already there, coat still buttoned against the cold, working through a borrowed, dog-eared score he had found shelved wrong in the library, filed under sermons rather than music, as though God himself had misplaced it there for him to find. He never asked leave. He never boasted of it to the other boys. He simply came, played until the bell for chapel, and slipped away, as though he had done something faintly improper, though I could think of few things in that school less improper than a boy loving something enough to court the cold for it. His father, I should say, had been no musician at all, a stonemason who cut lettering into headstones and the reveals of window arches for the cathedral works yard, a broad, quiet man who died of a fever the winter Thomas turned 9, leaving a widow and 3 younger sisters and a scholarship place the dean's chapter had granted more from charity than confidence. Thomas rarely spoke of him, but once, drying hymn books with me in the vestry after a burst pipe had flooded the choir library, he told me his father used to hum while he worked, matching the ring of the chisel to some tune only he knew, and that the piano felt to him like an echo of that same hammering made gentle, struck, and named, and made to ring true. I have thought of that sentence often since. The piece he had chosen from that misfiled score was Bach's Italian Concerto, the whole thing too large a mountain for a boy with no teacher, but the first movement, with its bright, running joy, he had all but memorized by ear and stubbornness. Note by note, wrong turning by wrong turning, corrected the next morning. I did not tell Dr. Sennett this. It was not my place, and besides, I suspected, wrongly, as it turned out, that there would be no occasion for it to matter. The competition list went up on the board that afternoon, 11 names, and under it, in Sennett's neat hand, the closing piece assigned to young Rupert Aldous, 15, the head chorister, who had studied piano since he could reach the pedals, and who would, everyone agreed, close the afternoon with credit to the school. Thomas's name did not appear on the board at all. He read it once, from the back of the crowd of boys, and then went in to evensong, and sang the Nunc Dimittis so purely that a visiting canon wiped his eyes, and told my husband afterward that he had heard boy choristers in 3 cathedrals, and none to touch that treble. Gifted enough to be admired, not, apparently, gifted enough to be believed. The bishop came on the Saturday, robed in violet, with 2 canons and a scattering of county families filling the wood-paneled hall where the grand piano, polished that week until it threw back the candlelight like water, stood waiting beneath the hammer-beam roof, dwarfing every boy who approached it. I sat near the front beside my husband, and beside me an empty chair that should have held Dr. Sennett's sister, who had taken a chill and stayed home, so that I had a clear view of the whole program in my gloved hand, counting down toward the name I had watched crossed off a board 3 days before. The competition went well enough. Small boys stumbled gamely through minuets. One, no older than 8, forgot his piece entirely halfway through, and was rescued by gentle applause and a pat from Mr. Pruitt. Rupert Aldous was announced last, as the closing performance, the pride of the afternoon, and rose from his seat looking every inch the young gentleman his family's fees had made him. He had reached the piano stool, had in fact just seated himself and flexed his fingers over the keys, when he went the color of the candle wax beside him and pressed a hand to his stomach. It was over in a moment. He had been unwell since breakfast, we learned later, and had said nothing, dreading to disappoint. But the moment itself was long enough for the whole hall to see a boy half rise from a piano stool and be helped, green and trembling, out through the side door by Mr. Pruitt, leaving the bishop of the diocese and 40 guests, facing an empty program and a silence with nothing in it to fill. Dr. Sennett stood at the front, and for the first time in all the years I had known him, looked entirely at a loss. He glanced toward the door Rupert had gone through, toward Mr. Pruitt's empty chair at the piano tutor's place, toward the bishop who was consulting his pocket watch with the particular patience of a man who has sat through worse and will say nothing about it either way. I do not know precisely what made me stand. I have turned it over many times since, in the quiet of the deanery, and I think it was simply that I could not sit in a room with an empty piano bench and a boy 2 doors away who knew, note for note, exactly what belonged on it. I crossed to Dr. Sennett and spoke low enough that only he and my husband could hear. Dr. Sennett, Thomas Yellen knows the Italian concerto, the first movement entire, from memory. I have heard him a dozen mornings before matins. He looked at me, the way a man looks at a suggestion he has already half decided is impossible before it is finished being spoken. Mrs. Blythe, I appreciate the sentiment, but this is not the moment for— It is precisely the moment, I said, for I count no better one coming. The bishop's watch clicked shut. 40 guests waited in a hall gone very quiet, and Dr. Aubrey Sennett, a man of principle rather than cruelty, weighed a boy's unproven claim against an empty program and a bishop's patience, and found, I could see it cross his face like weather, that he had, in truth, nothing to lose by asking. He found Thomas at the back of the hall among the younger boys, crouched forward with his hands between his knees, watching the door Rupert had gone through with an expression more of worry for his fellow chorister than of any ambition for himself. Yelland, Sennett's voice was not unkind, only clipped with urgency. You told me once. No, I am telling you now. Can you play the Bach? Here, tonight. Thomas looked up. I watched something move across his face. Not triumph, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of quiet astonishment that the door he had given up knocking on had opened from the other side. Yes, sir, he said. I can. He walked to the piano the way boys walk to the front of a church to be confirmed, spine straight, chin level, trying very hard not to hurry, and not quite managing it. He was small for 10, smaller still against that great gleaming instrument, its black lacquer holding the candle flames in long trembling lines, its keys pale as altar linen under the hall's lamps. He had to draw the stool in himself. No one had thought, in the scramble, to set it for a boy his size. He did so without fuss, climbed up, and sat with his patched jersey sleeves pushed back from his wrists and his chapped hands resting, for one long moment, absolutely still above the keys. The hall had gone the particular silence of an audience unsure whether to be embarrassed for a child or for itself. I saw the bishop lean very slightly forward. I saw Dr. Sennett standing rigid by the piano's curve, his earlier certainty gone entirely from his face, replaced by something closer to dread. The dread, I think now, of a fair man who fears he has just handed a frightened child a public humiliation to match his own private one. Thomas began, The first notes came out small and careful, almost apologetic. The opening theme picked out with the particular tenderness of a boy who has only ever played this passage for an empty room and a cold morning. But by the fourth bar, something in him seemed to remember that the piano did not care who was listening, and his hands found their stride. The bright, tumbling right-hand figures, Bach's Italian brilliance, built to sound like two keyboards answering each other, though there was only one, began to leap and answer themselves under his fingers, with a clarity that made old Canon Featherstone, 2 rows ahead of me, sit forward with his hand cupped behind his ear, as though he could not quite trust it the first time. I watched the room turn the way weather turns. A county mother who had been fanning herself grew still. A boy near the front, one of Thomas's own dormitory, mouthed the words, "He never told us," to his neighbor. Mr. Pruitt reappeared in the side doorway, having settled Rupert into a chair with a glass of water, and stood frozen with his hand still on the doorframe, staring. There is a trick to that particular movement. My husband explained it to me long afterward, over sherry, being a fair organist himself, by which the 2 hands must sound almost like 2 separate instruments answering each other across a courtyard, loud and soft, near and far, as the old harpsichords once used their 2 manuals to argue with themselves. Thomas had no second manual, only the 1 keyboard and a boy's ear for what forte and piano ought to feel like, though no one had ever taught him the Italian words for either. He found the terracing anyway, some passages ringing out bright and open, others drawing inward to a hush you had to lean forward in your seat to catch, and the drop between them was so exact, so unmistakably a choice and not an accident, that Canon Featherstone turned to me at last and murmured, "The boy is shaping it. He is not merely playing it, he is shaping it." By the true heart of the movement, Thomas was no longer a small boy hunched over borrowed hours before matins. His whole body had loosened into the music the way I have seen choristers loosen into a descant they have sung 100 times and finally trust. The left hand kept its steady, walking pulse, patient as a clock, while the right hand ran the bright cascades above it, crossing and doubling back, the ornaments falling exactly where Bach had asked, and nowhere he had not. There was a passage, I do not know the technical name for it, though my husband, no mean organist himself, told me afterward it was the sequence where the 2 implied voices chase one another up through the treble, where Thomas's hands seemed almost to argue and reconcile, and the whole hall held its breath together, as though we were one body listening. He missed nothing. He hesitated nothing. Where a lesser player might have hurried the difficult passages to be free of them, Thomas leaned into them, unhurried, the way a boy leans into a hill he has climbed every morning before dawn and knows by heart. The grand piano, which had looked so absurdly large behind him when he first climbed onto the stool, seemed by the middle of the movement to have become exactly the right size, or perhaps it was Thomas who had grown to meet it. I could not, in that moment, have told you which. The final pages of the movement gathered themselves the way a wave gathers before it breaks, the rushing figures climbing, doubling, resolving downward toward the close, and Thomas rode them without a single falter, his chapped hands, the same hands that had gone still and cold, reading a crossed-out name on a board 3 days before, now closing the piece with a chord that rang out clean and full and final into a hall that had forgotten, entirely, how to be anything but silent. For 1 heartbeat, nobody moved. I think we were all of us afraid to break whatever had happened in that room. Then the bishop of the diocese, a man not given to displays, rose to his feet, and the whole hall rose with him, canons and county families and 40 guests, and loudest of all, a ragged cheering knot of choristers near the back, who stamped their feet on the flagstones until the old roof beams seemed to ring with it. I saw the boy who had mouthed, "He never told us," now shouting it instead, grinning, thumping his neighbor on the shoulder. Thomas sat very still on the stool through all of it, his hands returned to his lap, looking for all the world as though he could not quite believe the noise was meant for him. Dr. Aubrey Sennett crossed the floor alone. I watched him go, and I confess I held my breath, for I did not know a man of his particular pride could bend without breaking. But he came to the piano, and instead of standing over the boy as he had stood over him with a pen 3 days before, He did something I have never forgotten and never will. He lowered himself, robes and dignity, and 15 years of certainty and all, until he was crouched at the piano stool, level with a 10-year-old's eyes, so that the whole hall watching could see plainly that the choirmaster had chosen to look up at no one and down at no one, but straight across. "I told you," he said, and his voice, though pitched low, carried in that stillness to every corner of the hall, that you were only a voice. He paused, and something moved in his throat before he went on. "I was wrong, Yelland. I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong." Thomas did not gloat, did not even quite smile, only looked at his choirmaster with the grave, unguarded relief of a boy who had never wanted to prove anyone a fool, only wanted, at last, to be believed. "I didn't mean to disobey, sir," he said. "I only couldn't stop." "Then you shall not have to," Sennett answered, and rose, turning to face the bishop and the hall, with the particular firmness of a man correcting his own record in public, which I have always thought takes a rarer courage than any performance. "From Monday, Master Yelland will have formal instruction on the pianoforte, alongside his choral duties, under Mr. Pruitt's own teaching, and at the school's expense. I will not have it said that Kingsmere let a gift like this go unfed, for want of a schoolmaster's certainty." The applause came again, warmer this time, and Rupert Aldous himself, pale, but recovered and standing now in the doorway, was among the first to clap, calling out something generous and boyish that made Thomas duck his head and laugh at last. A real laugh, startled out of him, the first I had heard from him all that long afternoon. In the weeks that followed, I watched the shape of that Saturday settle into ordinary life, the way the truest changes always do, not with fanfare but with a Tuesday afternoon timetable. Mr. Pruitt cleared an hour after choir practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and more than once I passed the practice room to find Dr. Sennett himself, standing in the doorway, arms folded, listening without a word, and once, only once, leaning in to correct a fingering himself, before catching my eye and looking faintly abashed to be caught minding a pianist's business, rather than a chorister's. Thomas's voice, if anything, only strengthened that year, as though the two gifts had never been rivals at all, only two rooms in the same house he was still learning to live in, and by Michaelmas, even the youngest boys had stopped remarking on it, the way boys stop remarking on any wonder once it has simply become true. I walked home across the close that evening with my husband, the cathedral bells just beginning for 6 o'clock, and looked back once at the lit windows of the school hall, where I could still make out, faintly, the small dark shape of a boy being shown by his choirmaster exactly where to place his hands for the second movement, as though there were no time left to lose, and all the time in the world besides. I have watched a great many performances in that hall over the years, and heard a great many voices raised in that cathedral, in earnest praise of things far holier than a Friday's piano competition. But I do not think I have ever, before or since, watched wonder and humility arrive in a room at exactly the same moment, walking in together, on the arm of a 10-year-old boy who had only ever wanted someone to listen,